on quantum thinking. By quantum thinking, I'm obviously using the term and alluding to the great breakthrough in physics and mathematics in the earlier part of the 20th century. People like Heisenberg with his uncertainty principle, and Schrödinger with his famous cat that was both dead and alive at the same time. So after many, many centuries of binary thinking in physics, a number of philosophers and scientists began to question this, and they came up with the idea that the either-or approach to the deepest elements of matter do not work. In the famous experiments, they showed that the experimenter influences the experiment, so you cannot have pure and objective truth and science. Everything is relative. And they also showed that you could send some electrons, and you couldn't predict. Some of them would go one way, some would go the other way, and there was no law that would predict which way they would go. And some phenomena, as in the cat, could be both dead and alive simultaneously. It was an enormous stretch for our philosophical and scientific ideas, most famously with Einstein, who for a long time rejected it and said he didn't believe that God played dice. In other words, it was all chance rather than based on physical laws. But he gradually absorbed quite a lot of it, and many people now accept that certainly at the microscopic level, the laws of quantum physics apply. Now that's what I mean by quantum, and it applies much more widely than in just physics. There are elements of that kind of quantum thinking, of course, much earlier. You find elements of it in David Hume's philosophy and in other philosophers who have refused to accept just a straight binary system of thought. But it's come to be dominant in the 20th century. For example, in mathematics and computing, probable systems, probabilistic systems, sometimes called Bayesian research or search systems. Bayes was a mathematician who thought in these probabilistic ways, and probabilistic means it's probably this, but not certainly, and that's quantum thinking. Now, what interests me, because I'm not a physicist or mathematician, is the way in which it can be found much, much more widely in philosophical systems which I've encountered over my life. As an anthropologist, I started going to Nepal in my mid-20s and have been many, many times there. And then I started going to Japan, and in the last 20 or so years, almost every year to China. And what I discovered there, and was shocked by, because it went against all my binary thinking, was a quantum world. That is to say, the absolute distinctions between right and wrong, heaven and hell, God and non-God, nature and culture, vanished. I started to find myself in a Himalayan shamanic village in a world where there were none of these category oppositions, and you could have a pluralistic world with many things being simultaneously true. The most extreme example that shocked me was there was no absolute religious fundamental truth. There was no God with a capital G. There were lots of godlings, baby gods as it were, living in the rocks and the trees and the rivers and so on. And there were lots of spirits, ancestor spirits in the fireplace and above the mantelpiece, bad spirits up in the forests and so on. There were ghosts, there were things called boots and prets, which were evil ghosts. And you mixed all this together, along with two of the major world religions, that is Buddhism and Hinduism, and you just took a bit of each as it was appropriate. So in extreme cases, you could in one day go through a breakfast, throwing some rice to an ancestor, going down and doing a little puja to a Hindu god down below the village, and then coming back in the afternoon and perhaps going to a Buddhist funeral ritual, and then in the evening going off and witnessing a shamanic trance and healing. And there seemed to be no worry about moving from one to the other. And that was just an extreme outside manifestation of a world which I found it very difficult to grasp hold of, because it goes against all my categories. And later I discovered the same thing in Japan. I could never get my Japanese friends to say that this was absolutely true or absolutely sound. Nothing was absolute. Things were all on a flux, of a continuum from one thing to another. And I thought, well, this is just Japan. But when I went to China, I found the same thing, that they mix together. They would have elements of a very Chinese form of Buddhism, Chan or Zen Buddhism, but that didn't recognize any boundaries or oppositions. Zen doesn't have any oppositional thinking at all. It's total and whole and undivided by oppositions between, for example, truth and non-truth. Many things are simultaneously true or not true. And likewise, they have Taoism instead of Shinto. And Taoism doesn't recognize any opposition between nature and culture, humans and nature. Everything is suffused with energy and with life, both human things and the world around us. So there's no oppositions in Taoism and ancestor worship and so on. And their philosophical systems, Confucianism, for example, none of it was binary or oppositional. And even their political systems, they didn't regard the world as their enemy against whom they had to fight. Their economic system was not based on Western types of economic motivation, and likewise their law. So you saw it in their art everywhere, that they were living in a quantum world. Of course, it's difficult to think of that because we think of quantum as recent, but from very early on, they lived in a quantum world and still do to a large extent. In other words, putting it in Jasper's terms, it's a non-axial civilization, or axial light, L-I-T-E as I put it. There are elements, certainly in China, as Jaspers and others pointed out, there are elements of axiality and opposition, but on the whole, the general tendency, and among the interesting consequences of suddenly rethinking this, is to look back from that world to my own and to question my own and see how narrow and aggressive it is. So China is based much more on harmony, and in its famous symbols, yin and yang, they appear to be oppositional, but they're not really, because if you look at the way they're just depicted, yin has, as female, has a bit of yang, a bit of the male within it, and the male has a bit of the female within it, a little circle within it. And also they're constantly changing in flux. So male turns into female, female into male, and so on. So the seasons turn, the genders turn, life turns, and it's not fixed in any way. Now this had possibly negative effects. It made it difficult to first develop modern science, for instance, and control nature as we have in the West. On the other hand, now, for a pluralistic world, which is trying to live in harmony, a great virtue in such quantum systems, if we're trying to live in harmony, then perhaps this quantum way of looking at things is something we should consider and mixing in with our own, and not rejecting as some backward Eastern mystical kind of phenomenon. because it is, after all, the basis of much of our best science now. Thank you.